Welcome to video 2 of the chipboard desk tutorial. In this video I'm going to be building the legs as well as cutting them into the top and painting and varnishing the desk. To begin with, I'm going to be cutting the timber I'm using for the legs down to rough lengths, making sure they're long enough. I'm doing this because the timber is quite bowed and where I want to plane them nice and square. If I kept them at the long lengths, to get them nice, straight and square, I'd have to take off a lot of timber. By cutting them to length, that means I'm not going to have to cut off as much when planing. Now that all the timber is cut to length, it's time to go over to the surfacer. Because I have got no workshop, I've had to set this outside the shed. Unfortunately, I still don't have any dust extraction either, so it does make quite a mess, but it still gets a good finish. To begin with, I'm surfacing a flat face on every length of timber. When there's bow, I make sure the bow is pointing downwards. Otherwise, I just rock along the timber and never make it square. Once all those faces are done, I then go on to put on a square edge on the timber. This I'm pushing it nice and firmly against the fence. Once I've surfaced all the timber, I then go on to thicknessing it. I'm taking off 2 mil from each pass and running each timber through twice. This will get me down to my final size of 38 millimeters. I did try and bodge together a dust extraction, but it didn't work, so I'm just going to have to let it go. Being in open air, it's still pretty good air quality, and I'll have to sweep it up once I'm finished. Once all my material is planed up, it's now time to mark out the legs. To begin with, I'm marking out on my desk so I can use that as a template to work off when cutting. Now I don't have a big roofing square, so I'm using the 3, 4, 5 rule to give myself a nice square. That's where you measure 4 of anything along a line, so I'm using 400 millimeters. 300 millimeters, you draw an arc, and between the end of the 400 and wherever you measure 500 mil to your arc, and that will give you a nice square line. I'm using the marked out legs on my bench when cutting the timber. This allows me to get the perfect angles and lengths so that they're exactly right and both legs are the exact same. Working in this way also allows me to mark out the joints as I go. This allows me to visually check everything works right, and I know which joints are being cut out of which timber. I'm cutting the joints with a miter saw with a depth stop. This allows me to get the perfect cut to the perfect depth. I'm also going across the joint and cutting curves into it. That way I can clean it up with a chisel later on. For cutting the mortise member of the bridle joint, I'm using a table saw with a fence to run it along to cut each cheek. I then flip the timber over and cut the other side at at the same time, to finish off with a coping saw and a small chisel. As I'm cleaning the joint up, I constantly am checking it against the corresponding pieces. This way I know when it fits right, so that I don't take off too much or not enough. That way when it comes to gluing it should be a nice tight fit. Once all joints are cleaned up and fit, I like to put it all together and check it against the drawing which is on my bench. That way any small adjustments that need to be made I can, but this one fits well so I can move on to the next one. Once both A-frames are finished, before gluing up I will be cutting out the lap joints for the supporting timbers which the desk will sit on. timber that goes at the front of both A-frames and goes across that supports the desk needs to be cut at an angle. This is the same angle that the front legs are at, so that way the desk will sit on it nice and flat. Now that all the joints are cut out, it's time for the A-frames to be glued together. I'm gluing these both at the same time, using each other to glue against. That way I know once they're both fixed, they're exactly the same size. Once the glue is set, it's time to clean up the joints. I'm using a low angle block plane as well as a belt sander. Once it's all cleaned up, it's time to mark out the cutouts where the top will sit on. You'll see this detail later on, and you can see it within the drawings. I'll be using a jigsaw for this. Now that the A-frames are finished, I can use them to mark out the sides of the desktop for where I need to cut them out. I do this so then I know they're an exact fit. I'm marking them 100mm from the back edge. After those cuts are all cleaned up and the A-frames fit nicely within the desk, I'm going to dry fit the whole desk together with the cross members to make sure that the desktop fits onto the bottom frame before looking to sand and varnish. Now onto gluing the base up. I'm using PVA glue again for this. I'm just gluing the faces of the joints on the cross members and clamping them to the A-frame. I'm then putting on the desktop so I can clamp to that. This allows me to get a good fit, make sure everything's nice and square and fits right. I used some 180 grit, then 240 grit to sand down the legs, ready for painting. I also sanded down the desktop as well for varnishing, making sure there was no rough edges, so that it will be nice and smooth when using it. With the legs I use knotting to cover up the knots. This will mean once it's fully painted the knots won't bleed through. I've now moved into the garage, putting on a second coat of knotting and starting varnishing the drawer fronts and drawer top. I then primed the legs with a wood primer ready for the overcoat. For the desktop I'm using floor varnish. One reason is because it's what I've got already in the cupboard, and the other is because it's hard wearing and the desk's going to see a lot of wear. I want it to be able to stand up to everything that's going to be put through. After about 4 coats of thick varnish on the top and the drawer fronts, I'm giving it a final sand just to smooth it off. I'm not worried about it being super smooth. Because of the grooves in the chipboard already, I'm just rounding off that front edge so it's nice on your forearms and making sure the top's nice and smooth and there's not any sharp edges on the sides. Unfortunately, due to camera difficulties, I didn't capture me painting the legs, but I did 2 coats of black and then sanded it flat and made sure there was no high points, and then did a final coat of black, which finished it nicely. This is the final fitting, and it fits nice and tightly and secure. I've decided not to screw through the cross bracing yet until it's in the location it will be. This will mean I can easily move it around, and having these screws accessible means that whenever I need to move it in the future, I can just unscrew them, take the top off, and move the top and the legs separately. And that's it. That's the build complete. Like I said, all the plans are on the website, and if you're on the website you already know that already, as well as the written instructions. So yeah, I'm really happy with it. Things I might look to do in the future for future development is I'm gonna, if I can get my hands on a little bit of leather, essentially play around with leather handles or even a hidden metal top handle. Yeah, I'm really happy with it. Alright, bye bye.